If you've clicked on this video, it's because you're probably interested in how over-the-air TV can be enhanced, or also you're interested in ATSC 3.0. Now, first off, for some context, I have been monitoring my over-the-air TV channels that I receive here in Western New York for over 5 years, and I have 13 antennas that are all spatially separated, picking up signals from 360 degrees up in an attic and in another section in the house here. And I've been monitoring not only the antenna's performance, but what I'm monitoring is the actual signals in the air. And I've picked up on a lot of patterns over the years during summer months, winter months, fall months, spring months, when there's snow on the roof, when there's no snow, when it's windy, when it's rainy. And what made me make this video is because I just got back here. I'm off work right now, and I've got some online classes that I'm taking for college, and I had a little bit of time to fine tune our over the air TV setup here. And especially since it's like Bills game season here, like it's NFL season, and I'm in the Buffalo area, so it's Bills country. And that's obviously a very popular thing to watch over the air. And then there's also all of the fall shows that are going to be on the various channels, so I always like to just make sure that everything is fine tuned. And as I started messing around with some of the antennas, I just remembered when I was in high school, all of the perils that I went through to try to get stations in, and it just reinvigorated in me how ATSC 3.0 could just be so much better than the current ATSC 1.0 standard we're currently using for TV. And it actually took me, because you forget about it, because we're constantly talking about DRM or signal signing or how things were done in other countries, but like actually when I remember back to like when I used to install antennas for people and actually like going back to actually using large antennas, fragile signals in an area like this in Western New York, which is very different than South Florida. It really got me thinking again about how 3.0 could actually solve all of the problems that we're currently experiencing with ATSC 1.0. Let me make this analogy, and then I got to go over a couple key terms. So, I'm not a huge fan of this analogy, just because I don't like, anything gruesome, but you could think about ATSC 3.0 as a steak knife. Could you use a steak knife to carve a steak or to cut a steak? Yes, that would be a very good use of a steak knife. Could you also use a steak knife to stab somebody? Yes, I would not recommend it. Horrible, horrible use of a steak knife. But could it technically be done? Yes. ATSC 3.0 is literally analogous to that. ATSC 3.0 could be used for a really righteous reason. It could be used really well, 100% of the time. Used extraordinarily well. It could also be used for nefarious purposes. We're seeing mainly a nefarious operation of ATSC 3.0. Maybe using the steak knife for something other than a very righteous reason for that, at least from a consumer point of view. And we've seen that with, Sinclair's ATSC 3.0 stations raising, and this is a keyword that you're going to hear a lot, so I'm going to define this in a second, raising the minimum SNRs or signal to noise ratios. That's a very bad thing. And we've also seen a lot of deployments of digital rights management encryption. So what I have seen is not a lot of good steak knife carving a steak, and more of a maybe not so good use of a steak knife. Maybe instead of stabbing somebody, I could say I'm using a steak knife for cutting up vegetables. Maybe that's not the, best use of a steak knife, but I think you get my analogy. So, you have tools, and I think at the end of the day, that steak knife is just a steak knife at the end of the day. ATSC 3.0 is just a tool. It's just a technology at the end of the day. It's the human beings behind the tool, the human beings behind this that will actually determine what it's used for. And unfortunately, what I've seen is not a lot of very good use cases of something that could be used very, very well. So, with that out of the way, I'd like to define a key term. You're going to hear me say this a lot, like a lot, a lot. And probably in a lot of my other videos, you've heard me say this as well. And I want to make sure that everybody's on the same page because I know there's people coming in potentially from this video from all different backgrounds. You're going to hear me say SNR or minimum threshold SNR. SNR is signal to noise ratio. That's what the acronym is for. Signal to noise ratio. Now, the best way for me to describe this to you would be think about you and a friend are in an NFL stadium and it's super loud and noisy. So think about it like this. There's the signal part, which is somebody that's talking to you in the stadium, and then there's the noise. Everybody in the stadium that's shouting, talking, whatever, and it's a lot of noise. There is a threshold at which you can hear their voice and discern what they're saying. Like, actually, no, he just said, John went to go get a hot dog. Like, you could actually hear them say that. And then another time where you just hear, John got a hot dog. And there's a threshold at which you can actually discern John went to go get a hot dog to a bunch of garbled mess. And you could, in a way, call that signal to noise ratio. In all radio communication systems, it doesn't matter if it's broadcast TV, if it's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, anything that uses radio, FM radio, again, anything. All of that uses fundamentally signal to noise ratio for that radio communications discernible limit. An NTSC analog broadcast TV, for a lot of you who are much older than me, that would be the TV standard that you potentially grew up with, broadcast over the air. That was around from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. You get the point. That analog television, the luminance carrier, which is the black and white information, the point at which you could see a very barely discernible picture of maybe it's super fuzzy, the TV picture was super fuzzy, but I could just barely make out a human figure or a dog in the scene or something like that. Like, you can just barely discern what was on that analog TV picture. From that point to the point where you could just no longer see anything and it's literally just a bunch of snow, that was 15 decibels of signal to noise ratio for that luminance carrier. Now, the color information was added to the analog standard later on in time, and that was powered much lower and also requires a higher SNR, signal to noise ratio, for a minimum to be able to see any color. That's around like 25 or so decibels. Jumping ahead in time to ATSC 1.0, which is what we're currently using for digital over-the-air television right now, what I'm sure you guys are all very used to. The minimum signal to noise ratio, the minimum threshold SNR for ATSC 1.0 is approximately 15 decibels. Now you may say, wait a second, I used to receive analog broadcasts way easier than the ATSC 1.0 broadcasts now. What gives? It's because analog broadcasts were powered way higher than ATSC 1.0 broadcasts are now.
In the central Ontario, Toronto, and Mid-Eastern regions, you see Global on Channel 22 from our transmitter at Uxbridge with power of 5 million watts.
In fact, ATSC 1.0, believe it or not, most people wouldn't think this, is actually a way superior standard at noise mitigation than NTSC was. Because think about it, now, when you're at a 15 decibel SNR for ATSC 1.0, what happens is you get a perfect picture, and then as soon as it drops below that 15 decibel mark and it goes to no signal, you go from perfect picture to no picture. Whereas with the analog era, it would slowly fade to like barely being able to discern anything to not being able to discern anything. Now, ATSC 3.0 is a lot different. There are so many combinations. There are literally billions of combinations for ATSC 3.0. It is mathematically impossible to deploy around the world every single possible combination just because there's way too many. So, the minimum threshold SNRs for ATSC 3.0 vary depending on the deployment. You can deploy an ATSC 3.0 broadcast with a minimum threshold SNR as high with some layered division multiplexing configurations as high as 40 decibels. So a huge signal to noise ratio. You need a ton of signal coming in or the noise to be non-existent in order to receive whatever they're sending, whether it's a video stream or other data. And it also can vary as low as about -6 decibels. So what does negative mean? Well, 0 means the noise floor. 0 means there is as much signal as there is noise. So they're balanced. Noise is the same amount of power as signal. When you go below 0, it means that there's literally less signal to grab from than there is noise. So as you can see, both NTSC and ATSC 1.0 have never had anything like this before. So it's a very more modern thing to be able to have a radio system communicate error-free and actually be able to have a fully beautiful looking picture below the noise floor. And of course, there are minimum SNR configurations in between. So there's -5, -4, -3, -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, etc., all the way to basically 40. So there are tons of combinations that you can have. You can set it at whatever you want. Now, to give you an idea, here in Western New York, there is a station WNYO. It is an ATSC 3.0 lighthouse here in the Buffalo region, and they have two PLPs, which are physical layer pipes that you can set an SNR threshold at. PLP 0, the first PLP, has a 9 decibel SNR. So 6 decibels lower. It's 6 decibels easier to get in PLP 0 than it is compared to ATSC 1.0 or even the luminance carrier of the old analog broadcasts. But that PLP 0 only has their data delivery as a service, which is Sinclair's data casting model for businesses to allocate data capacity for private organizations. It's not meant to be received to the general public. Their other PLP, PLP1, that PLP has an SNR of 21 decibels. And that has all 5 TV channels on it. There's only 5 TV channels on the lighthouse, and that has all 5 of them. The issue with that is that now it requires 6 decibels higher of a signal to noise ratio. Your antenna has to be better. The signal conditions have to be better, or the noise has to be lowered 6 decibels more in order to get in that signal at the threshold. So there were a lot of people, especially in Canada and in rural communities here in Western New York, that when they raised that SNR, when they jumped from ATSC 1.0 to ATSC 3.0, they, had a lot of people unfortunately not be able to receive any TV channels just because that SNR is now so much higher. Now, the good thing is that is actually against FCC rules. So I actually just contacted the FCC a week ago and told them that this station was not operating per FCC rules that state that all ATSC 3.0 stations have to operate with a minimum threshold SNR the same or better than traditional DTV service, which traditional DTV service is ATSC 1.0. So what that means is ATSC 3.0 broadcasts by FCC rules have to provide at least one TV channel at 15 decibels or lower. Well, they're clearly not doing that. The reason why I'm making this video is because if there's anybody from the FCC that's watching, or anybody from Sinclair, or if you know anybody in the industry, please let the industry folks know that you're not supposed to broadcast at least one TV channel higher than 15 decibels, and you're impacting a lot of over-the-air viewers by making it more difficult. Now, unfortunately, that is just one reason out of a ton of reasons on why I don't use our ATSC 3.0 lighthouse here in the Buffalo region, and it's very unfortunate because, again, ATSC 3.0 has so many awesome benefits to it. Between that and many other things, which I'll get to in a future video, I just barely use our ATSC 3.0 lighthouse. Now, getting on to the main point of this video, which is ways that ATSC 3.0 can be used positively to really impact reception in a very positive, meaningful way. And that stems back to all of my experience with over-the-air TV here in the Western New York region. So it's funny because I just have lived in South Florida for the last 3 years, and I'm going to be back. I'm getting a new apartment down there in January. For now, I'm going to hang back here in the 716 for a few more months. But that being said, tweaking the antennas around and really experiencing what it was like, back when I was in high school and installing antennas for people just brought me back to that realization of how difficult it can be here to adequately get in over the air TV, and also how this area is kind of a paradox and has a strong dichotomy of, in my opinion, being the potentially the best place in the country for over the air TV, yet at the same time, the worst place in the country for over the air TV. And again, I just spent time in South Florida for the last 3 years. It is way different and way easier there, which you would think with all of the tropo and all of the water that's close by that it could cause issues with the signals. And it doesn't anywhere near as bad as the Great Lakes do here. So, just for some context, Western New York is a very unique region. So, Western New York is in the Northeast. The Northeast is filled up with cities that are super close together. And that stems back from the days of horse and buggy, when people just didn't travel as far to settle a new region, right? You go right now to Colorado, rural Wyoming, rural Utah, rural Nevada, rural New Mexico, rural Arizona, you will not see cities as close together as they are here in the Northeast. Well, that creates a problem because we have only so many radio frequencies to use for over-the-air broadcasting, and every market needs their own unique frequencies. So, where I am here in Buffalo, we are very close to another market, which is only 2 counties away, which our counties here in the Northeast are very small comparatively to many out west. Only 2 counties away from where I am right now is Rochester. Now, Rochester's TV signals are 54 miles away from my location, and they need their own frequencies. So that carves up a lot of available frequencies. Well, I've also got my home market of Buffalo that carves up some frequencies. And then there's also Canada, right? I'm right next to Canada. Western New York is literally right next to Canada. Now, what makes our area unique here is the fact that we are right next to a city called Toronto. The funny thing is, I always know when somebody is from the Western New York or Toronto region because they will call it Toronto, like I'm pronouncing it, and not Toronto. If you call it Toronto, I know you're not from around the region. But Toronto is so massive, and a lot of people don't realize just how big Toronto is. Toronto is the third largest city in North America, and I am 45 miles away from it. So you can think of it as the New York City of Canada. So think about how many TV stations and how sardinely packed New York City's market is, and just think that it's like that for Toronto, except you also have Rochester and Buffalo, and you also have just 100 miles south of here, Erie, Pennsylvania. And all of these markets that are super tightly packed together. Making matters worse are 2 things. Number one is the fact that in Canada, they have very different rules for over-the-air broadcasting than we have here. They are very stringent with multiplexing, unlike in the US, where a broadcaster could have their .1, .2, .3, .4, .5 with all these subchannels. they don't really allow that per se, because in order to multiplex with another channel, in order to have a dot two, that dot two channel in the community of license that they're in has to be in a different language. And there's a few examples of some mom and pop stations with their dot one in English, dot two in Arabic, dot three in French, but it's very rare to see a station with multiple English channels multiplexed. Just as an asterisk right now, they've allowed it a little bit in some extenuating circumstances. One of the stations is CHEXDT, but anyway, that's a different video. So, literally, in order to have in the same community of license a broadcast, the only way to have more than one channel is to have them in different languages. So, very, hey, I'm not Canadian, I'm not to judge, but very weird rules in my opinion. So, why does this matter? It means that you need to have more stations, more actual stations taking up a whole RF channel around the region. So, for instance, in America, what would have happened with CTV and CTV2 is CTV would have been on the dot one and CTV2 would have been on the dot two, and they would have shared the same 6 megahertz RF channel. They would have shared the same station. And in Toronto, what they do is in one community of license, in the Toronto community of license, they have CTV, CFTO on RF channel 8. And then for CTV2, they have to have it in a different community of license. So their main station is CKVR-DT in Barrie, Ontario. And then they also have a couple retransmitter sites in Hamilton and in Fonthill. I can receive the Hamilton one. The Fonthill one is actually one of the closest TV stations to this house, believe it or not, and it's a Canadian station. But that station has had some electrical issues and it's not at full power. It's really weird. But you get the point. There are just so many more stations on the air hogging up frequency space. So that exacerbates things a lot because there's just so many more frequencies that have to be shoehorned and used, which crams spectrum. And then the last part to just add that cherry on top to everything is the fact that there are 2 Great Lakes right next to us. I swear, you have to actually live here and be here to experience the impact that the Great Lakes have on radio signals. There is a TV station called CHEXDT. I alluded to it a little earlier. What's fascinating is that this station is 82 miles away from this house right now, and it is line of sight the entire time. And it's because the majority of its journey is over Lake Ontario. It's very, very rare if you're not on the top of a tall mountain, which we're not here, we're relatively low elevation here, to still be able to get a station in past 70 miles and have it be line of sight. So not only is it rare to just have a TV station come in past 70 miles, it's extraordinarily rare to have a TV station come in past 80 miles and still be line of sight. So this is a super cool station. I love getting the station in just because it's so far away. It's so cool. So these lakes act as a blessing and a curse at the same time. The blessing is that it's flat and it allows the signal to just zoom right over the lake. The problem is the lakes create all sorts of fluctuations with the atmosphere that screw around with radio signals a lot. And there is no better example than right here in Western New York with our Canadian stations interacting with our local stations and all of the markets that are relatively close by. It gets to a point where stable reception year round for even our NBC, ABC, CBS becomes pretty difficult because of how extreme the tropo can get over the lakes. Like I said originally at the beginning of this video, I've been monitoring our TV stations here for 5 years. There have been times where I have completely lost my NBC, I've completely lost my CBS, and there are stations across the lake that are just absolutely booming in here that I could receive with a paperclip. In fact, there was a time during my WaveMax antenna review where I was getting in that Chex DT station extremely strong that piece of crap WaveMax antenna was able to pick it up. And that is exactly how this area works. And I was just trying to fine tune some antennas, and the whole day the station was coming in 16 to 17 decibels, perfectly fine. And all it took was just a little bit of fluctuation in the atmosphere. And then what happened is that channel disappeared because it dropped below that 15 decibel threshold for ATSC 1.0. So what if I told you that ATSC 3.0 could literally solve everything that I've been rambling on about this whole time? Let's start with the spectrum utilization, the RF channels that are being hogged in Canada and, all of these various regions. ATSC 3.0 uses HEVC. HEVC uses only 25% of the data capacity required as ATSC 1.0's choice of MPEG-2 video. So that saves 75% of the data capacity right there. Less data capacity required to send out TV channels means you could fit more TV channels on a single station, which means that more stations could go off the air, freeing up available bandwidth for less congestion, less co-channel interference, things like that. Now it gets better because I actually do not like HEVC, which is 75% more efficient, like I said, than MPEG-2 video. There is a codec as of 2020 called VVC, and believe it or not, it's actually a part of the ATSC 3.0 standard, mainly because Brazil, it seems, actually wants innovation, and the broadcasters in our country don't. Anyway, VVC will send the same looking picture as MPEG-2 video using only roughly 12.5% of the code, which is incredible. So it's literally twice as good as HEVC. And then there's another technology called LCEVC. This is an enhancement codec. It gets layered on top of an existing codec. It could be literally layered on top of anything. It could be layered on top of MPEG-2 video. It could be layered on top of VVC and everything in between. Even AV1, any of the open source codecs, doesn't matter. This video enhancement codec can achieve up to 40% savings on top of an existing codec, which means that you could literally get, if you used VVC with LCEVC as an enhancement on ATSC 3.0, a TV channel that looks the exact same using less than 10% of the binary code required, less than 10% of that data capacity to send a TV channel. So that is awesome. Unfortunately, VVC pretty much requires a lot of hardware implementations, especially when we're going at the TV level, which have super cheap components that would pretty much never be able to software decode VVC, whereas this computer right here would be able to software decode it perfectly fine. In fact, I've tried it out many times. Same with a cheap Android phone and anything that actually has a decent processor in it. LCEVC, on the other hand, doesn't require that many computational resources at all and could easily be deployed on existing TVs with a software update. So we could realistically get ATSC 3.0 using maybe around 15% of the data capacity requirement compared to ATSC 1.0's video codecs if we were to use HEVC with LCEVC. And that's something that I hope broadcasters do. It's something that Brazil is doing with ATSC 3.0. So that's on the coding front. You can see that you can get a lot more efficient with the code. And in theory, you could also apply this with ATSC 1.0, but now we're getting into tricky territory of how easily it would be to upgrade the ATSC 1.0 receivers. On the other hand, you've got the actual physical layer, which is what I really like about ATSC 3.0. And that physical layer is the actual RF waveform that transports the bits. ATSC 3.0 has all of these tricks to make it so that it is way more efficient at sending bits compared to ATSC 1.0. With ATSC 3.0, it is 30% more efficient at being able to send code at a given SNR. So think if ATSC 1.0 can send 19.39 megabits per second at its 15 decibel SNR, well then ATSC 3.0 can send 24 megabits per second at its 15 decibel SNR. And it gets even better because ATSC 3.0 also has MIMO, which I'm going to be talking about in a future video. MIMO can double that data capacity, so at 15 decibels, you could receive, instead of 24 megabits per second, 48 megabits per second, and still be at a 15 decibel SNR. So we've just jumped from 19 megabits per second to 48, and it's still the same receive SNR. So these things compound. Better code, better video compression, better ways at sending a very good looking TV channel, and then the underlying physical layer and everything that is enhanced on top of that. So, like I stated earlier, ATSC 3.0 is flexible. What I was just talking about with that TV channel that I was receiving, that later in the day it just went away because it just dropped below that 15 decibel mark. What if that station were an ATSC 3.0 station and it had a minimum threshold SNR of 3 instead of 15? Well, then that would never happen. I would never have to worry about that station going above and below that threshold ever again. All of those stations that are marginal would have lots of breathing room now and would never go away. You would just never see it say no signal ever again. And also, I shouldn't be losing my NBC station during super bad tropo events. If my NBC station had a robust SNR, my likelihood of losing it would decrease incredibly. And I just wanted to interject to say that it's not like I'm receiving these stations with a paperclip or something. I have 6-foot antennas that receive these signals at 40 decibels every day. That is how strong the tropo was. It lowered the SNR by 25 decibels, over 25 decibels. So it's not like I've got some piece of crap setup. My setup is absolutely amazing, and it can happen with super bad tropo. So that's why I'm saying ATSC 3.0 would mitigate this way more if that option was available. And that's what's so cool about all of these new video codecs and all of the cool things that you can do with the physical layer. You know, people make the valid argument that when you have an SNR that is super robust, you know, when you have that minimum threshold SNR, like below the noise floor, you can't send a lot of TV channels. Well, the thing is, right, if you were to use VVC and LCEVC, for instance, if it uses just 10% of the data capacity, if an MPEG-2 video channel required 10 megabits per second, VVC with LCEVC only requires 1 megabit per second. If there was a channel, like a 480i channel, that required 1 megabit per second, what's 10% of that? 100 kilobits per second. That can easily fit on a PLP with an SNR as low as -6 decibels. So these are all things you got to think of. As long as we get the video coding lowered enough, the video streams will still look very good and you can provide a very cool experience. And that is how ATSC 3.0 can make all of these situations so much better than they currently are. And the other thing too is something that I just experienced the other day. It was windy here, and I'm looking out at the trees right now and they're kind of wagging a little bit because there's a little bit of a breeze. All of the ATSC 1.0 signals will pixelate when there's a lot of wind. Even the strong ones, they always pixelate. With ATSC 3.0, you don't have to worry about that because of OFDM, guard intervals, and fast Fourier transform, or FFT. These are all technical, geeky things that allow you to actually pick up on a broadcast signal with an extreme tree wagging in the wind without having to worry about any loss. The other thing too is something that I experience here in this house quite frequently with all of these electronics. Our dishwasher emits all sorts of nasty interference when it's turned on. And that is a major problem with ATSC 1.0, especially on the VHF band, and it tends to be more prevalent. There is something called time interleaving. ATSC 1.0 has pretty much very simplistic to no time interleaving. With ATSC 3.0, you can make the time interleaving selection an option to where your noisy dishwasher or your noisy blender or some sort of electronic device in your house that's causing all sorts of noise and interference that's distorting your VHF channel completely disappear. It makes it so that you pretty much don't have to worry about it at all, and that is by sending data out over time. So you're using time to your advantage. Now, the only downside is that the more robust you make it against the noise from these electronics, the longer it takes for you to have a TV picture show. But I would much rather have that than a picture that's constantly pixelating on those troublesome frequencies. And also, even the smallest option available for ATSC 3.0 still does a decent amount to combat against that. So there's all of these things. There's minimum SNR thresholds and protection against trees wagging in the wind and time interleaving against, distortion and impulse noise and all these things. Everything comes together at a culmination to where you could really have an awesome experience. And I just want to end on this note. Like I said, I've been tracking TV stations here for a while. As soon as the ATSC 3.0 station in Rochester went on the air, to give you an idea, Rochester signals here are very marginal. I barely get them in. They will go above and below that 15 decibel mark all the time because there is so much terrain in between. It's not line of sight. There's like 7 or 8 ridges in between the transmitter and here, even though it's only 50 miles away. There's a lot of multipath and a lot of bouncing and a lot of really crazy things with the signal. In fact, one of my first videos on this channel was showing the multipath fading that exists with this channel and showing how ATSC 1.0, that SNR threshold, is just bouncing back and forth like hot potato the entire time. The ATSC 3.0 broadcast has been stable the entire time. There's other parts of the ATSC 3.0 signal. There's something called the bootstrap, which is way more robust than the lowest possible robustness level to send TV streams or other data. There's also the preamble, which sends L1 basic and L1 detail. I'm going to talk specifically about the L1 basic and the L1 detail. Those carry information about the station, configuration information, all sorts of pretty cool info. To give you an idea, in the about 2 years that that station has been on the air, a little over 2 years, I have never lost the preamble data, ever. And that's because it's being sent at -7, -8 decibels, around in there. The L1 basic data and the L1 detail information has been rock solid throughout everything that I've talked about, with all of this horrible tropo over the lake and all these distortions. That has been rock solid the entire time. The other station in Toronto that's an ATSC 3.0 station, which is VBA 257, I've had the full power flagship Toronto stations go off the air, and I've had a station from Erie that's on the same frequency as this Toronto ATSC 3.0 deployment come in strong, yet I'm still able to get in the L1 basic, the L1 detail, and the bootstrap from that station. That is how amazing ATSC 3.0 is at being received during times of very difficult conditions in the air. And that is why we truly do need a transition to ATSC 3.0, and we need a transition done responsibly. And I believe that this transition will require government oversight, government regulations, where it balances the interests of the broadcasters with, what a concept, the interests of the consumers, the interests of the citizens, of which these are our shared public airwaves. So anyway, this has been an incredibly long video. It's just some thoughts of mine to share with you guys. What do you think of all of this? Let me know if you have a similar situation, if you live by some of the other Great Lakes and have kind of a similar situation with some of the crazy tropo. Let me know. And let me know your thoughts on this whole situation. I'm going to be doing a more in-depth video specifically about Toronto and the stations that we get in here. Because like I said, the Toronto stations are crazy with the amount of content. There's exclusive NFL games, there's exclusive NHL games that you can just receive from Canada, which is why I said this area is a blessing in a lot of ways with how good the content is, because of how diverse the stations from Toronto are, especially being the flagship city of Canada. So let me know what you think. I'm definitely going to be making lots of more videos. This is just kind of a general overview. But other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video that hopefully will not be this long.